It's my great pleasure to welcome our first four contributors who are going to form a panel to look at the question, why have there been no great British artists? I'm going to explain, well not explain, going to suggest what that question might lead to in introducing that panel. But what we're going to do is give a chance for each of those speakers to present a perspective, a view on British art, on Britishness, on art, and identity from their own distinct perspectives. There are full biographies of the speakers in the conference pack, so I'm only going to very briefly introduce them in turn. They are arranged alphabetically. It's not there's no secret plan here. Each of the panels is going to present in alphabetical order, and therefore the first of our speakers for this first panel is Philip Dodd, who is well known as a broadcaster and author, who has made really kind of seminal contributions to the larger debate about art and identity over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So if you welcome, please, the first of our panel, Philip Dodd.
It's 25 years, I realise, I've been writing on this, or probably 30 years, so it suggests that I may have changed my mind over that period of time. Let me say what I want to try and do today. I've got no slides. I thought I should force you to listen to words. I feel I've been at this conference for about the last 25 years. And by that I mean that it's full of public sector people, almost entirely, and almost entirely today the speakers come from public institutions. And there's no real recognition that the ecology of the art world has changed, that there's been a cultural revolution. Now, I spend a week a month in China, or rather a week a month on an aeroplane is what I sometimes think. So I have a different view to when I first began thinking about these things in the aftermath of the Falklands War. And I want to share that sense of what Britishness and Britain and art mean, and how the revolution that's happened over the last 15 or 20 years mean that these conferences in future should be very different and need to be very different. At the moment in Miami, there's an enormous art fair, the Miami Basel Art Fair. In the beginning of January in Singapore, there's another large art fair. Towards the end of January, there's another large art fair in Delhi. In May, there's an enormous art fair just been bought by Art Basel called Art Hong Kong, and in June, there will be Art Basel. Now, the truth about these fairs is they themselves are offering a version of British art. These global fairs, they're extraordinarily important. You'll find a lot of the major museum directors there either speaking or wandering around. You'll find most of the large collectors in the world. Most of these major fairs, and of course there are many minor fairs, in between, offer a particular version of British art because a certain number of galleries go to those fairs. Listen, White Cube and so on. So there's a definition of British art being offered globally now, being offered by the private sector. You can name the people who really represent British art in this sense. They're Damien Hirst, they're Julian Opie, sometimes they're the Chapman brothers. If you're lucky, the Modern Institute brings Jim Lambie, but he was a Turnham nominee, so he's okay anyway. So it's a very small number of people, but it's an extraordinarily important way in which British art is being formulated and, as it were, defined, much more important in those circumstances than the British Council, who hasn't got much money and anyway tends to do things much too late. So that's one part of the ecology that's changed. I think the second thing that's changed, and I'm going to speak mostly about modern and contemporary art. The second thing that's changed is a number of galleries, independent galleries, that 30 years ago would have given retrospectives to artists who were living in Britain, have joined that global trend. So they would include the Serpentine and the Whitechapel, places that 30 years ago would have absolutely given mid and older artists who were practicing in Britain. And largely that does not happen. It's true that the Tate still gives us, it's giving at present a Barry Flanagan show, but it's much harder now to see older artists working in Britain, to see the full range of their work. It's now interesting that it's private galleries who often are giving retrospectives. So Dennis Creffield, one of Bomberg's students who's owned by Lackmer, who's owned by the Tate, he had a retrospective at Flowers East. So that's another element that's changed. The third is the issue of the emergence of private museums and private galleries, private museums and private collections. Ian's just mentioned Charles Saatchi, and of course Saatchi himself has offered recently a big Newspeak show, which interestingly then travelled to the Hermitage. So here you've got a private museum sector, and let's just remember Charles Saatchi did an appallingly bad Chinese art show, but it got 400,000 people to it. Okay, 400, I mean, it's extraordinarily impressive to get 400,000 people to see a show of artists who largely nobody's ever heard of. So in terms of popularity, there's a case that these private museums are at least as important in terms of outreach as a lot of the public museums. And I'm aware at the moment that I'm speaking of London and England. The Tate itself has changed. Jackie Woolschlager in the Financial Times said, and I think not wrongly nor disparagingly, that the Tate is the best populist museum in the world. And I think that's true. It tends to organise its exhibitions round individuals, Barry Flanagan, John Martin, Gerhard Richter. You go and compare that with the way the Pompidou does shows. It did a show last year, the Distiel exhibition, was extraordinarily careful, scholarly, but much, much less popular. And I'm not necessarily against popular. When the Tate does period shows, it did a show here about 4 or 5 years ago on the 60s that, to be honest, was lamentable. It was completely orthodox without having been violated by a new idea for a long time. It offered back to the visitors an account of the 60s that had no scholarly interest whatsoever. If you go to Catherine Lambert's show, which she's got at the moment at Haunch of Venison at a private museum, a private gallery, you can see a much more interesting, argumentative view about what constituted British art in the 50s and the 60s. One way of thinking of Paolozzi, who I knew very well, is I once asked Eduardo why in 1963, 1964 he'd done a series of screen prints about Wittgenstein. And Eduardo said to me, Philip, because I was weary of all that Americanism and I wanted to find a really true European intellectual, as is when is a collection of screen prints about Wittgenstein. So there's some really interesting things to be done about Paolozzi and Schwitters and Europeanness, but it's not being done in the public institutions. Now, I've lost my mobile, which is often one of the things I do. How long have I been speaking for? 10 minutes. Okay, so I've got 10 minutes. So what I've tried to do just very quickly is outline the people, the institutions who now speak for Britain, or speak about Britain, or define British art. They range from art fairs to private galleries to private museums. There's an enormous kind of wide range of institutions inside that ecology. And I think the crisis, in a sense, that arises by coming to this debate is a crisis of institutions like the Tate and like the regional and national galleries. It's a crisis that these institutions are no longer confident that they speak for Britain, to misuse Amory's famous quotation about speaking for England. That actually the real crisis over the last 30 years hasn't been in Britishness or Englishness, but it's been in an elite, using the word descriptively, who historically have spoken for Britain. They include the universities, they include the museums, they include the BBC, one of my employers. And in those last 30 years, there's been a crisis of these institutions because the ecology has got richer, more complex, and in that time, they have lost a large amount of their authority. I'm in favour of them losing their authority. They have to earn authority, really, rather than simply inherit it. You know, if one was going to give a different kind of lecture rather than in 20 minutes, you need to look at Harold Perkins' book called The Rise and Fall of the Professional Class. One needs to think of a class of people who arose in the post-war period, who belonged largely to public sector institutions, who were professionals, who, you know, to use Stanley Fisher's great theoretical phrase, who understood and recognised one another more from a nod than from a wink. They shared a kind of understanding. And when Charles does what Charles always does, I haven't read The Guardian for years now because I can't take The Guardian seriously as a newspaper. But, you know, if one read The Guardian today and reads Charles, I know what he's doing, yeah, and he's doing all those things. But he's kind of hammering from the outside at what he thinks of being a kind of settled elite with a settled view of the world. One of the interesting things about this elite is it's largely been secular and it's largely been progressive. I won't embarrass him, but one of the directors of the National Gallery, Riley, once said to me, he said, you know what was the most ethnically diverse exhibition we've ever had at the National Gallery? He said, it was an exhibition of medieval religious art. Because, of course, the truth is there are very large numbers of people who want to go and see art, but they don't want to go and see art which a kind of secular, liberal, progressive, you know, art curatorial class want them to see. What they want to see is pictures of Jesus, which I've produced in their time, not some bad art. But I'd love to see a curator pitch this as an exhibition to their peers and their bosses. So my view is you're in an interesting situation. I speak like this because I'm one of the few private sector people here today. The public sector's in a really interesting place. You can keep having conferences funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund until there is no Heritage Lottery Fund, which my guess will be sooner rather than later. Or you can begin opening the doors and opening the windows and letting in some of the other voices, the other institutions. You know, to have this conversation and not know that much more powerful than almost any institutions are the auction houses. Whether we like this or not, the auction houses, you know, Chinese people don't believe in Chinese art. Okay, you talk to any interesting Chinese artist or interesting critic, they don't believe in Chinese art as a category, but the art market believes in Chinese art. And largely, Christie's and Sotheby's still believe in something called modern British art. And they're one of the defining institutions that shape what globally constitutes. Do you ever find them at these events? No. Do you ever find Jay Joplin's lot, White Cube's lot at these events? No. The truth is, it seems to me that there's got to be an opening of the doors and windows. So it isn't just, you know, honourable institutions, you know. And I was educated by the Sheffield City Art Gallery. When I moved from my mining village and went to Sheffield when I was 15, my education came through Sheffield City Art Gallery. So, you know, I owe it an enormous amount, but the world's changed. And I don't think institutions that are gathered today quite recognise in terms of this debate. So I want to now pose, because I have about 2 or 3 minutes left, I want to pose what, to quote Lenin, what's to be done. Now, one way is to mimic what I call global British art, which is the art that's carried in the art fairs. And, you know, you need to go to these global art fairs just to see how popular they are. The queues around Art Hong Kong can take you an hour to get in. And the definition of British art that most people in China are seeing are the ones being offered by these art fairs. So one way you can do it is to mimic what I call that kind of global British art. And this is a really interesting question because there are a lot of new museums and galleries being built, the Turner, the one in Wakefield, ones in Scotland, and so on. What do you do with these new buildings? Do you mimic, as I said, do you get Douglas Gordon and Damien Hirst? And of course, what is Tate offering for next summer's Olympics? Damien Hirst. And of course, the Tate itself is inevitably embroiled in this global dance, which is part of the reason it needs the money and the rest of the museum sector is being starved of money. So one way is to become part of that kind of global art. And there are about 20 artists from Britain who count in that global. So in Delhi in late January, I'm on a panel with Mark Quinn, because Mark Quinn has made it into that kind of global world. The second way is, as it were, to hold on to what the auction houses call modern British. To think in terms of that, not these global, but those kind of modern British figures. And of course, there's a very interesting way in which they're ripe for being rethought about. So landscape, which is, you know, a kind of traditional category, now looks very different around notions of ecology and sustainability. And those of you who know Jonathan Bates' book on Wordsworth and ecology see what you can do by revisiting traditional, as it were, categories of British art in the light of new political imperatives. The third would be to try to collaborate with some of these new museums, private museums. So, of course, the Saatchi, one of Saatchi's recent shows went to Leeds. I know I said another went to the Hermitage, but you don't only want to deal with Charles because he's extremely difficult. But for instance, in last summer in Edinburgh, there was a big show of Tony Cragg, you know, an artist born in Liverpool. Its next stop is at a private museum in Shanghai with a guy called Darsha Khan, who I happen to know in the Himalayas. Now, the truth is there are museums popping up all over the place in Asia who are really, private museums, who are really interested in finding partnerships with Western institutions. It's a travesty and a tragedy, really, that it was Charles again who just hosted the first show of Indonesian art in London rather than a public institution. But it strikes me that you can absolutely network with many of these private museums in Asia to show different accounts of British art. So those are three things you can do. There is a fourth thing you can do. My partner's Italian, and we've spent the last week going around London trying to find some DVDs of Toto. Most of you won't have heard of him. Umberto Eco says he's one of the greatest artists of the 20th century in Italy. He's an actor. 100 films, extraordinary figure. Eco wrote a great essay about him. There are no such DVDs. He's never travelled anywhere. You can get him in Italian, but you can't get him elsewhere. The truth is, Toto's a great artist, even though nobody else apart from the Italians knows about him. So there is another way. You say, actually, forget the global world, you know, and just stick with what matters internally. But you can't. Because the truth is, that way you become Bates's Motel. You slightly get off the main road. And the truth is, the world, the global world is here. It's here in Saatchi. It's here in White Cube. It's here in the auction houses. You have to embrace them in this conversation, or you really will become Bates's Motel. Thank you.